yeah, Mariano's going to go first, so I'll just pass you over to him.
Thank you, Darren. There are some questions left from earlier talks. Shall I proceed reading some of the questions for Jyoti? Jyoti, are you there?
I don't think we've got Jyoti here.
Right. So, well, let's move on to outstanding questions for Marcia. Marcia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Hello. So there's two questions left from earlier. One is there some evaluation whether organic farms in Europe are mainly composed of small farms? If yes, how to engage the large ones for a more sustainable system? Question from Deborah.
Okay, thanks for the question. There are data concerning the size of farms in Europe, and they from Eurostat actually, and you can see the size of the farms by country. I don't have on the top of my mind the average size of an organic farm, but the data, I mean, it's there. Concerning how to involve the biggest organic farm in adopting agroecological practices, well, there is an important action that is carried out by IFOAM Organics. Since a few years, they are trying to they elaborated actually the strategy for Organics 3.0. I think that the main limitation now for organic is the regulation itself, which is not so strong in terms of pushing for the adoption of agroecological practices. I think that working to not just limit organic to the regulation, but to enlarge the concept to agroecology would be a good way to involve also big farms. So not just focusing on the regulation requirements, but go beyond. I think, yeah, it's not an easy task, but I think that organic organizations are towards this.
Thank you, Marcia. What do you think we should do, Darren? Just mix questions for all the speakers, or how do you think we should proceed with these with all the remaining questions?
So there's two things. Firstly, if anybody, any of the attendees would like to ask a question, obviously put that in the Q&A box straight away, and we will give that priority. And then otherwise, we will then go to some of the other questions that we've got from the previous sessions. We've got most speakers. We've got most speakers with us at the moment, other than Simeon and Jyoti. So I don't know if you can see who's in the room, Mariano, at the moment.
Yes, is this Esteban? Are you with us? I can't see his video feed.
Yeah, I'm here.
So there's a question for you. It says,
okay,
from Maria Silvina Fenoglu. She says, I wonder if the factors that determine segregation were also related to city size, as you showed for the labor market.
Well, I mean, yeah, as I was saying, most of the research that we have been doing is in large urban areas in which segregation is much bigger. I mean, you can actually see whole neighborhoods of racial and income groups living together. So I have to say that segregation in small areas is also important, especially in rural areas. But that happened also across different cities. So different cities have different, let's say, racial segregation or income segregation. So for the cities that we have investigated, the short answer is no. There is no dependence on the city size. There's a lot of dependence, for example, on public transportation, and the fact that cities with different, with the same size but different public transportation systems have different segregation. So it's not a matter of the size of the cities, and it's also a question of the accessibility and the means of transportation within cities.
Okay, and did you find a correlation? Another question related from moderator, I don't know who that is, could be any of us. Is there a correlation between income and the behavioral choices?
This is actually something that I didn't comment, but there are two dimensions of, we investigated also the roots of why people have this behavior that is more or less segregated. And there are two dimensions. One is the exploration. I mean, the fact that we tend to explore in the city new places. This is what we call social place exploration. And there is also what we call the social exploration, which is the fact that whenever we go to a new place, we don't care about who are there, or whether we just choose places which are very similar in terms of the patterns, similar to us. Okay, so these are the two dimensions. So the question actually relates to the first one, so the social, so the place exploration. So our lifestyles are actually the thing that I was saying during my talk, which is, for example, that you went at least once to the museum last year, tells you a lot about whether you are a social explorer. I mean, in general, this is actually models, and that actually implies that you are less segregated. But for example, people that like a particular type of shops or particular type of restaurants, they tend to be less social explorers, and they place explorers, and they become more segregated. So yes, the lifestyle is actually correlated with the income.
Thank you. Sharon, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I wonder if I could ask a question regarding the job networks, and in particular, this sort of transition between, I think you described them as the physical through to the cognitive jobs. And if you could give me some examples of what those sorts of jobs are, which sort of enable people to transition from one to the other.
Yeah, so there's a lot of managerial jobs, like for example, typically people that are in a factory doing, I don't know, the working in the, let's say, in the line of production, and then basically they change to some kind of managerial post, and then they, I don't know, have some education, retraining, and then they can get out actually to the offices. So these are the type of jobs that we are thinking about. There's also a lot of jobs that have to do with administration, like typically, for example, jobs in which you have a lot of interface to the public, like, and then you basically are retrained to have more managerial jobs. So these are the ones which allow you to transition from between physical and cognitive jobs. Some are impossible. I mean, I saw you this kind of fish-like network, and some of them are impossible to be reached easily. I mean, and the transitions are really hard. For example, it's nearly impossible to jump from a physical job to a mathematician. But if we have, for example, we actually studied. I mean, some people can do it, but it's really hard, especially in adult life. But we have also. But we have, this is kind of a joke, but we also have data about how people move in the US. And there are some cases of people that went from a mathematician to be a bartender. So that direction you can go, but the other one is really hard.
I do have a question related to that. You show that the connectedness of jobs, so the transitions among jobs vary with seat size. Is there any evidence of a sort of a kind of a phase transition in the network? I mean, after a certain seed size, the system gets really connected in the sense that these transitions, even if directional, as you illustrated now, becoming more common, or this is something that is more continuous as city grows, the network just get more and more connected?
It is more or less continuous, but obviously we have been studying, for example, shocks to those networks which are targeted. Like, for example, when we study the impact of automation on jobs, those automation shocks, basically remove nodes from those networks, which are happening only in particular sites of the network. I mean, and those sites actually are especially physical jobs, and that creates a more, let's say, gap or a wider gap between physical and cognitive, let's say, sectors, and that creates that the connectedness of the networks is actually much smaller.
Okay, thank you.
We have more questions for Esteban, but maybe we should mix with questions for other people. We have a question for Karim. It says, are you planning to make the relationship fragmentation biodiversity, including species and interactions, ecosystem function, including seed dispersal, seed set, etc., and food security more explicitly in the future?
I think I have had that question before, no? But
is it? Oh, sorry, I don't have it marked as a question. I have it marked as a question that was outstanding.
Yeah, but should I answer again?
No,
Maybe?
no, don't need to. Sorry about that. And there's another one. Just stop me if you have answered it already. What do you think makes a network a good or desirable network? What should we be shooting for? What would be the features of a good ecological network be?
I think that was done as well.
That was done as well. Sorry about that again.
Right.
To have not only technical problems, but problems of other sorts. So I don't think I'm going to ask any more questions now. I'm worried that any other questions? We have a question for Daniel. How are spatial aspects considered in your model? Some ecosystem services might be more local than others, as might stakeholder demands.
Daniel, you're mute.
No, I went out of the cave. So I think I already answered that question. Wasn't this how to consider spatial effects, right?
Yeah, but I do have a question related to that. So let me jump in. Do you think that one path to incorporate to move from your to use your mean field approach to the problem and incorporate some degree of spatial heterogeneity would be to merge your kind of models to meta-community models and then actually describe like this spatial structure that connects those nodes in a second step, like start with a Levins-like kind of metapopulation model and then move to a spatial network?
Yes, I mean it's definitely an interesting avenue, to extend the model or integrate it with meta-community dynamics. Yes, I mean I'm not doing it right now, but it's something that I would like to do in the future. What I'm doing right now a little bit more is to consider more like the spatial effects of fragmentation, but there's not a explicit meta-community mechanisms there. So maybe as a in a second step or something.
Okay. I think that one problem that I would like to hear your opinion of with people in this room. Let's call it like that. That is for many a theme that emerged in almost all talks was the challenge of combining different types of links or different types of networks. That's the kind of the big challenge of moving towards multi-layer networks. Do you think do you all think that the main problem is how to translate the units of those links to one another, or should we pay special attention to the spatial and temporal scales associated with that units? I mean, at the end, the problem is a problem of rates of different kind of effects, and we need to find a way of translate each effect in another to actually connect different networks. Yeah, Anna?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question and a really tough problem, and I don't have an answer, but I actually have an additional question to add to this, and that's, I mean, even the units that we look up in the single networks are sometimes problematic. So I think it's what we need is some kind of common framework how to measure this in various systems.
Yeah. I shared similar views with you, and I always get this trouble with when you have this network, we have this description, and then we have the interaction weights, and they means very different things for the interacting elements of the system. But I think that if we are combining networks of networks, like in the case of Carini, that you have space and then the ecological interactions over it, or in the case of Cecilia, that you have different roads for disease transmission. This posits a very extreme challenge, and maybe the solution is sort of zoom out. I mean, is trying to come up with some descriptors of the network effects that could be non-sensitive to this variation, and at the same time capture some interesting aspect of dynamics. Like one thing that comes to my mind, and is related to the question I asked to Laura, is that when you talk about indirect effects, they have like the short pathways, you have the direct effects, the short pathways, you have the things that you can actually get from the spectral profile of the network, but you also can get things from diffusion theory. Like you can use descriptions by describing a network as a place, the Laplacian matrix of a network. With very few parameters, you can actually get some intuition about how cascading effects can flow. So maybe I'm worried that the path of incorporating more and more data to try to connect those networks will not allow us to solve the problems of how to connect these very different kinds of data in an insightful way. That's just something that concerns me. And Laura?
I think you're totally right there, and I think at some point, so when I'm looking at the networks, I mean the food webs now, that we are describing more and more species in more and more interactions, and I think we come to maybe some point where we actually have to move in the other direction. So how can we, again, how can we simplify this and still understand it? So I mean, on your side there, that maybe it isn't more and more data, but we need to be able to handle the data in a different and effective way. And when it comes to the multi-layer network, I also guess it depends on how they are organized. Are the majority of the links and the flows actually going between the layers, or is it within the layers? Is it jumps between the layers, and then the actual dynamics going on within the layers? Then maybe we are in an easier spot. But I guess that's very different for different systems as well.
Yeah, maybe that is the usual assumption, isn't it? Like that, like we hope that the within layer dynamics is enough to get understanding what's happening. So Laura, and then Cecilia.
Yeah, I was going to say something that builds on what Anna just said. I think a relevant question is when we actually need these multi-layer approaches and when we can collapse some of the layers down as like a single input or parameter, like you were saying, Pablo. And we did that, for example, in the invasive species case. You could also have a network of the waterways where the zebra mussels are flowing, but we figured, you know, actually the dominant form of spread is through people, so let's collapse that. And you could also have an institutional layer there of who's working with who, but we know in that case that actually the counties are sort of myopically managing their own counties. So in that case, we collapse those two layers just as inputs that were sort of already embedded in that one layer. Because once we get these really complicated multi-layer networks, like where do you stop? Do you just like incorporate the entire planet? I don't know.
I hope it's is isolated enough, isn't it? Cecilia.
So this is one of the things that we tested actually in one of the papers, was that what's the difference when you collapse the network or if you work with different layers. And we also use different metrics because you can synthesize those networks with these metrics of interlayer connectance and these things. And the metrics, they could tell us a lot about the dynamics. So, and then in the end, what we found is that if you know the local structure of the food webs, for example, and the interactions with the vectors, you already have a lot to guess about how is the spreading dynamics there. So yes, it's possible to reduce this complexity. But one thing that you said that's about the spatial scale, and what is important is that because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the same networks everywhere. So you need to know what are the local interactions to have a guess about how is the spreading dynamics of the parasite there. Because, for example, I've seen a lot of recent works that they are relating like species traits with infection risk, but these are like meta networks that you join everything, and then if you start working with like aggregated networks, you don't know much about the local dynamics. So I think that the spatial scale is important in this sense.
Someone saying Mora?
Esteban is raising his hand.
Esteban?
Yeah. No worries. I mean, I have also the same problem because I don't know how I can. So this is a fascinating discussion, and I think from our perspective, for example, in the job networks and the problem in the research that I mentioned about the job networks, we ended up using some kind of mean field to describe the impact of automation by city. So basically, the whole information about the network was encoded into this WF, which is just job connectedness. And obviously, this is not the way you will go. For example, you want to understand the tiny little details of the people which are basically in one particular job, but this approach allows us to understand what's happening at the level of the city. So that's also one way to go. And when you are having massive disruptions in the ecosystems, most of the times the details of the networks are not so important. But some characteristics of for example, the things that we were saying, how connected are the layers, or how within and across layers. Those are the things that matter to understand the system rather than the specific details. So what I'm trying to say is that let's try to get as much details as we can, but not. I mean, we are never going to achieve let's say the whole description of the system. But it's better to have a good description that we are sure, rather than incorporating more and more data.
Yeah, when I related to that and the idea of mean field approach to the problems, for me one big issue in ecology is that we know that the different nodes in ecological network, like in different species, I'm thinking networks at the community level here. They perceive the spatial and temporal scales at different they perceive time and space at different scales, wildly different scales, like the populations of plants and populations of insects. They multiply the differences in space movements that you show us within a city. They multiply that for 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, or even more, when we think on persistence in time and movement across space. So this creates a real challenge of scale incongruency among the elements of the network. And well, maybe this is a problem that we will not need to face in the future, because all ecological networks will be contained in parks. And so we have a scale that we impose to all species there. But right now, this might create a really difficult challenge to predict how like diseases will propagate across ecosystems and then spill out to cities, or how pollination services would fail in which range of the agricultural landscape would be affected. So I think this is another aspect that we could learn a lot about the approach that both you and Laura are using to explore different types of networks that are structured in space, and then you are handling this kind of problem in very different ways. I think we have a couple more questions. I don't know if we have time though for that. We do, huh?
I wonder, Paolo, if I could just ask a couple of questions, just to sort of tie up the talks that we've had from the beginning of the day with the end. And I'm just sort of remembering that Jyoti's talk was very much sort of focused on, you know, how to bring about regenerative change, you know, particularly within business, you know, how actually business practices can start actually being positive rather than negative in some way. And one of the things that he started to do was to talk about, you know, resilience, attack tolerance, complexity, you know, all those sorts of things which have been spoken about today. And then I'm just sort of struck that Laura's talk at the end was very much about a network metric being pretty darn brilliant, actually, in terms of addressing that particular problem around invasion. So maybe my question to Laura is, you know, what sort of uptake is there by policymakers, you know, land managers, and so on, do you think, for bringing in what is essentially a new metric based on networks?
Yeah, so we're working directly with the county managers through the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Center, and my collaborator with the Forest Service is currently advising them. So I think there could be a lot of promise. Right now, the way that they allocate the funding is like which lakes have the biggest parking lots. So we think that they could do better, either with the optimal or with a metric-based approach. What we're really excited about doing is applying that type of approach where we match metrics to other types of management objectives. So you could imagine in the situation presented with businesses where you might have a network of businesses to instead potentially identify influential people in a network to try to, you know, convince or do outreach to. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, we're excited to test it in different contexts, but in order to get it actually adopted, you know, this has been a long co-produced approach where the relationships with the managers are in place already.
Thank you. And I've got one other question from our audience. It says, not sure for whom, maybe Cecilia, Laura, Anna, Karine, anyone regarding getting common units in these multi-layer networks. It's bound to rear its ugly head again, isn't it? So couldn't we use capita rates of infections? That could solve the within layer issue, but it remains the issue of how you link the different networks to each other in the same unit. Could we just have to go hierarchical, or can we get similar per capita rates as those for within layers? With the proviso that might have been a bit confusing, so sorry. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that. The thorny issue of units. No, it's far too late in the day.
I don't know if I understood the question, actually.
It was more about getting the common units within multi-layer networks. And so, yeah, the question was, can't we use per capita rates of interactions? Discuss, could that be a way of solving the within layer issue, for example?
Karini?
Yes, of course, I'll pop you up.
I don't know as well if I understood the question, but I just would like to make a point with this multi-layer thing that perhaps is very obvious, but I'm not sure. But the point is of using multi-layer is actually, what do you want with the multi-layers, right? I think there is maybe a hype that everyone wants to use multi-layers now. And I think, why do you want to use that? So what's the question behind the need for all these layers? And I think that goes with what people were saying just before. No, it can be endless. So in ecology, for example, we have some difficulty sometimes to think about, well, I want to understand all the interactions that are in a given community, right? But why do I want that, and how do I do that? So there is quite a few logistic issues as well to get the data, and then to put the data together, how you do that, and then you connect them. But I think mainly is, why do I want, what's the final point of using that? So it was something I used to discuss during my postdoc with Pedro Jordano, and we got in trouble in that question, actually. But one point used to be, for example, so if I am interested in the fitness of an individual plant, then yes, I want to get all the interactions that are involved during the lifetime of that individual plant. That's quite tricky, I suppose. But if I want to understand the ecosystem service, for example, one of the ecosystem service, maybe I don't even need all the layers, all those interactions, but just one that I am interested on, and then make some connections with other variables of the environment of the system that can be perhaps outside the network level or something like that. So, don't know if I answered, but that specific question, but that was just a point that I would like to make.
Thank you. And Paolo?
Oh, I would say that related to the question, I think I got it. If you can compute per capita rates, and you are describing within a layer, and assuming that you are describing the same process, like the demography of different species in a given place, so probably you are getting really close to solve the problem within the layer. But the problem is how you translate the demography that is occurring within the layer to the cultural impact of this system, ecological network, to the health quality of people in a city nearby, or in providing a given service for the agricultural landscape nearby. So the problem is how you move from one unit to the other, and I don't think that by just describing as rates will solve that. Also related to what Karini said, and I totally agree with her, that we need always to think about why we are describing these networks and why we are using this particular level of details is that maybe I would argue that we move in ecology, we move to networks when we realize that just study pairwise interactions in isolation was not enough to understand the consequences of ecological interactions. Like when you think on Payne's classical experiment with starfish, that tell what this experiment tell us that if you remove a top predator, everything changes, is that the consequences of ecological interactions cascade through the system, and you cannot describe that just as pairwise interactions. And sorry for the noise in the background. The kids behave well for 10 hours, but now they are crazy. So I would say that this leads us to the idea in the notion that more and more information will allow us to actually, just a moment, sorry guys. Sorry about that. Sorry, this led us to the perception that by adding data and information and describing the patterns of interaction in all the details, we would actually increase our level of insight about nature. And I think this is true, but there must be a limit. Like if you just think on a small number of species, like 20 animal species and 30 plant species, the number of possible networks with just a small number of species is as high as the number of electrons in the observed universe. So it actually is much higher than that. So it's the number of combinations is so huge that we need to find ways of simplify and aggregate. And actually, network descriptors are all about that. They are describing network properties in a very simple way with a single values or distributions or profiles of values, trying to condense this information. So I think that we need to keep this in mind when we try to especially in this world that data is available in the sense that you can collect a lot of data, that maybe sometimes you need to move a little bit back and think on some basic principles and in a very simple way. It might sound like a dinosaur talking about that in this age that computers are solving all our problems. They know more about us that we know about us. But sometimes it's like to look for something like thermodynamics and realize that with 3 different macroscopic descriptors, we can make trains move, cars work, and everything until 100 years ago to function in our cities. So I think it's a tale of caution when we think about adding more data.
I wonder, can I just add a thought as well in terms of, how we might go forward in merging different types of networks together, just with a practical example. So here in the UK, there's a big focus currently in tree planting, basically to kind of offset most of the damage that the country's been responsible for many years. But the real challenge at the moment is we've got different types of woodlands. We've got sort of commercially run plantations. We've got amenity woodlands, which are quite close to urban areas where people live. And then we've got some what we call ancient semi-natural woodlands, where we know they've been since the 1600s at least. And all of those sorts of woodlands attract people of different kind of backgrounds and different interests, and they are nevertheless all sort of stakeholders in those woodlands, in that they're other managers, or they're enjoying it for recreation, they may be landowners or whatever. And it's really interesting on the one hand to kind of think about how we might plot that social network, and then how any changes to that social network, for example, changes in land ownership or whatever, can then impact upon the structure of the ecological network in terms of the management of the trees within them. And then that got me thinking of the fact that many of our tree species in the UK are under threat. We have an exponential increase in pests and pathogens associated with climate change. And there's real concerns over some of our plantations, for example, and their commercial value in the future as to whether or not they're even going to survive as a monoculture. So all of a sudden, you've then got this possibility that, you know, our most abundant and popular trees with the public, like oak trees and ash trees, may actually be lost from areas. And so you can sort of imagine how you might produce an ecological network and look at the consequences of losing those species on not only the ecological network, but the social network too, in terms of that, how that impacts on the people that are interacting with them. So, you know, all of a sudden, I think there is a way for us to start looking at linking together these social networks with ecological networks and looking at the interplay actually between the two. And if that sounds sort of too simplistic, I think perhaps one of the other avenues going forward is thinking about how we might merge these types of networks in our afforestation programs. So at the moment, you know, we're kind of looking at, well, what trees shall we plant where? What impacts is that going to have on biodiversity? What are the carbon costs of the species in which we choose? And ultimately, if we involve people in those decisions, then actually we might see very different forests because of more people might be interested in increasing biodiversity than maximizing carbon sequestration. So I kind of think that, you know, a lot of the talks we've spoken about so far, we've talked about species loss and the consequences of species loss. But I do wonder, particularly with this sort of agenda of being regenerative, whether actually there's an opportunity here for us, regardless of our background, to think about the consequences of species additions or habitat additions to landscapes. And again, how that might impact upon the social networks and the people that use those. So it's just a thought, at least, in terms of, you know, some of the ongoing ideas that we've got, at least in the UK, because the reality is we don't really know what a future forest in 80 to 100 years is going to look like. And you even hear some managers talking about planting eucalyptus in the UK to cope with the extreme weather events that we're expecting. So yeah, it's an interesting time. I wonder, we're just running out of time slightly, but we've got one more question from Mariano, which I think you might throw out to the audience.
Yes, thank you, Darren. You're talking about interesting times. It might sound a bit off topic, but at the same time, I think it's quite timely. How do you think the pandemic has affected the structure, to put it generally, of your networks, or what long or short-term effect do you think it will have? It's a very general question, but I can't help asking it because I think it is a unique year in Earth's history. So how do you think your networks have been affected by the pandemic, or will be affected in the near future?
Anybody want to answer that?
There's no way they're not affected. So
maybe I can respond, Mariano, at least in the UK, where you know, most people live in cities rather than in the countryside. And one of the things that we've noticed during the lockdown was people essentially rediscovering biodiversity within their cities or towns where they lived. And we've been involved in some soundscape work as well, where we've just kind of looked to see the increase in biodiversity that we can record when all of the cars and lorries and other urban noise is taken away. Quite what the impacts on an ecological network in a highly kind of modified habitat typical of the UK. 75% of the UK is farmed in some form or another, and we have some of the kind of worst biodiversity records in Europe. I think that actually the real interest here might be looking at the social networks, and in particular how so many people seem to have been much more better engaged with nature than they were previously, and really surprised. We've seen a really big increase in Wildlife Trust membership and just general interest in natural history as a result. And I think what's driving that as well is also people's mental health. And so this idea that somehow reconnecting people to nature has some benefits on people and the way in which people interact is probably quite a fruitful area of research, and I'd be very surprised if people weren't doing it here in the UK, at least now. But I'll be interested what other people think in the parts of the world where they live. Let's go to Cecilia.
Cecilia was raising her hand.
Yes, so unfortunately, I think I had like the opposite feeling about the effect of the pandemic here in Brazil, because, well, maybe you already know that we are like living a big biodiversity crisis here that is related to the political crisis. And because of the pandemic, so everybody was at their the home, and you know that the current government, it's allowing a lot of things, and then it's passing a lot of environmental flexibilization, and then we started facing immense fires in the Amazon, fires in the Pantanal. So I think that it had like a great negative effect, and mostly because of the maybe people were inside home, and all the attention related to the pandemic. So you were at the time coronavirus, but you know the government was just allowing a lot of things to happen, and demobilizing the entire environmental institutions here. So I see it in a completely negative way that we find this impact. And now, well, we have the Pantanal in fire, we have the Amazon in fire, and this is more or less the perspective of the impact of the pandemic here.
Anybody else? Anna, yes.
Yeah, I can just say that my experience from Sweden has been a little bit like you were talking about there, and actually an increased awareness of nature and its values during the pandemic. Then if that will hold in the longer run, then that's a question, of course. But just to say that some can be positive effects as well in some areas.
Mariano, why don't you?
Esteban is raising his hand.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. I must be in one of your corners, Darren, in the monitor. No worries. So here in the US, I think probably combining Cecilia and your comment, I think one of the big differences is that here, for example, in the US, there's a lot of people, especially, for example, in areas like New York, that have discovered suddenly Vermont. And or I don't know, other states, and people have changed the luxury of going to the theater to the luxury of having a backyard in which you can actually have I don't know, your own space and things like that. And I think the difference between Brazil and other countries is that here you can go anywhere and you can still work. I mean, you can actually have a good internet connection. You can have all the services. But in other places, like for example, we are also studying Mexico City, that you cannot do this. There's only one place that you can probably a bunker in Mexico, which is building in Mexico City or around Mexico City. So what we have seen here is that, at least in the United States, that there's a lot of people actually rediscovering nature. You have to see at the Instagram these days. I mean, everybody's somewhere, like doing, I don't know, hiking or sending pictures from, I don't know, the middle of the nature, etc. So I think that's great, but I think that there might be other countries in which that is also luxury. You cannot go to other parts of the country because the conditions for working there or for, I don't know, moving there are very different.
Mm. Daniel.
Yeah, I have a small thought. So listening to all your comments, I think it's quite interesting the situation that there's a virus hitting a group of people that form a network, and usually we have read all the time that this type of structure in a network confers more stability, etc. Because the disturbances propagate less efficiently or reaches fewer number of individuals or whatever. And in this case, it's interesting because there's been a disturbance and the network has changed the structure in face of this network. It's not like a disturbance that propagates or whatever. It's a disturbance that arrives, and then that network tries to adapt or rearrange to fight the disturbance. And of course, there's a lot of spatial variation in these adaptational changes. So you mentioned in Brazil or in Sweden or in the US or here in France. I mean, we're confined here for the second time. So I mean, the different, the variation in the connectivity of these spatial networks has changed, and it would be interesting if somebody gathered data to see what are the effects on, social preferences, ecosystem services as well.
Thank you. Does anybody have any other comments?
Karine is raising her hand.
Karine, I'll pass you on.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting what Danny just said. And I just from Brazil, I completely agree with Cecilia, but also regarding what you were saying, Danny, I read somewhere today, this morning before this event, actually, if someone saw that in Brazil newspaper, maybe you can help me because I can't remember exactly where, but it was relating because you're having increasing numbers of cases in Brazil as well, but the number of deaths seems to be stable or even not as high as expected in the beginning. And that was the article I was reading was exactly saying about that there was the formation of modules within the network of where the virus is within our social classes. Because I don't know how much you know about Brazil, but it's the social classes here you have a few people that have a better condition to go to these luxury places and spend their quarantine. But most of the people that have to work and go in this very busy public transportation, for example. But what happened, it seems that there was these bubbles that are these models in the society in which the virus is circulating, and they were expecting perhaps a second wave as these models start to converge again. So this is an interesting point of seeing the resilience of or not of modularity in this type of network, perhaps. But I don't remember the paper, but if you saw something, Cecilia, maybe you can, yeah.
Thank you. And does anybody else have anything to say? Mariano, do you want to give us your perspective from Argentina?
It's complicated. My question was more related to what I think Danny said, that the social networks have changed and they have adapted in a probably very complex way, because some networks could be broken down into smaller pieces, but others couldn't. I don't think I can give a perspective. I'm just maybe think that there are some very, very interesting questions there that maybe can be answered in the future. See how the whole system has changed. I mean, for some systems, human influence has been removed very significantly, whereas in others have not changed at all. And I think it's just a very, from a scientific perspective, it's a very interesting global experiment. And I'm really keen on seeing what the consequences are going to be, mostly from a network perspective, of course, which is why we're here. I think it would be very interesting to see the sort of information that Esteban has on equality and segregation, and if you can overlap that with the coronavirus spread and see how that affects disease spread, and I think that things like that would be just very, very interesting to see. Maybe next year we can do another symposium and see if there have been any research in that area. But here now, I think it's pretty similar to this. No, just the general response of the public. I think it's quite similar to what's been going on in Brazil, where we are brother countries, and in many aspects we behave quite similarly. So it's not too different from what has been happening there. Well, Esteban, you wanted to?
Yeah, actually, using the data that I presented for the segregation, we are studying also the COVID propagation, and Daniel is completely right. But I have to say that most of the adaptation of the network has been done through these strict measures, like overall measures, like, for example, the lockdowns, the curfews, shutting down the events, the restaurants, etc. Every time, using our data, every time we see that there's a reopening, people tend, a lot of people, not the majority, but a lot of people actually tend to come back to the let's say, the pre-pandemic levels. I'm from Spain, and during the summer they opened the restaurants and they were crowded, like everybody was in the restaurants again. So I think we have an opportunity. I have to say that I'm looking forward to come to what we had before, because I miss the face-to-face, I miss the serendipity of meeting new people. I miss the conference, guys. I mean, I really miss the going for a coffee break and having random conversations. But I think also we have an opportunity to not to replicate the bad things that we had before. Like, for example, in terms of biodiversity and in terms of ecological networks, the kind of things that we were doing in the cities, or the kind of things that we were doing in other systems. I think we have an opportunity to or for example, the working places, like the fact that we have to commute every day 40 kilometers to be in the same place as your co-workers, which is an idea which I think right now it's kind of crazy, right? Like you have to commute 40 kilometers to have a coffee with your boss, which is, so I looking forward to come to the original, let's say, at the pre-pandemic levels, but also this is a huge chance to break and not replicate the bad things that we had before.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, we've been talking now in the panel session for an hour, so I think it may be time to draw our symposium to a close, not least as Paolo's internet has gone down at some point, but he's trying to get back in. Let's stop Paolo from speaking anymore. I just got one final comment that Pedro Giordano put on, which I just want to sort of say now so that it gets recorded on the YouTube channel, and it was to do with the units in multi-layers, and he said that you might need some quantification of effect when using these multi-layers. It might be estimated as a standardized unit list value. Then you need to tune the interpretation of those results based on unit list interaction weights. Same as when we use relative fitness estimates instead of absolute measures of fitness components. So thank you so much, Pedro, for that comment. So I'm going to draw the symposium to a close. I just have a few thank yous to make, not least to our speakers. Thank you so much. We've jumped around the world from Hong Kong to Sweden to the United States, UK, France, Brazil, Argentina, and that's really quite remarkable. When we had people tuning in at breakfast time and at dinner time, people have been eating meals. That is one of the joys, actually, of these online symposiums, even if we can't have coffee together, as we've just discussed. Paolo also survived a major thunderstorm where he is as well, so it's just been absolutely miraculous, actually, that most people, well, everybody actually was able to give their talk, or we were able to show their talk, and we didn't have one of those embarrassing moments where the whole thing had cut out for 20 minutes and we were left panicking what to do. So that's actually worked really well. I don't think we kind of knew just quite how stressful it was going to be trying to get everybody organised around the world to take part in this. I'd like to thank the team for putting this together. Mariano and Paolo and Deborah and Julia made some fantastic suggestions for who to invite. We were delighted that virtually everybody who we approached agreed to give a talk, and I think you'll all agree it's just been a really super symposium in that sense. I would like to add my thanks to Katie Sawyer from the School of Natural and Environmental Sciences at Newcastle University, who sort of helped us behind the scenes in terms of putting on this symposium. The biggest thanks should go to Fred, who's been liaising with all of you and has been doing such a sterling job behind the scenes putting this on. I don't think any of us knew just how problematic it was going to be using Teams to put on this. The reason why we did this is because we have a university license to use live events for hundreds of people. We found out yesterday when I spoke to my school manager that she said, well, why are you using Teams? We always use Zoom and we just pay the difference. So had we have known that at the beginning, maybe that's what we would have done. And well, we found out the hard way. So thank you, Fred. You've done a brilliant job getting this together. And then lastly, just so that you're all aware, we will be posting the entire symposium onto the Newcastle University YouTube channel as soon as possible. We will send out those links to all of the attendees and the speakers so that you can click on those and watch them later at any time that suits you. But otherwise, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for those who have tuned in, and let's do this again sometime soon on Zoom.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.